Without any further ado, would you please welcome Neill Franklin.
Thank you, Jacob. It's a pleasure. It's a real pleasure to be here on the campus of Spelman, historical institution. I'm from Baltimore. Any of you guys heard of Baltimore? Yeah. Morgan, Coppin State. Any of you guys from Baltimore, Maryland? Hey, shout out. Absolutely. So I grew up in Baltimore. But, you know, I'm thankful to be doing this. We did a similar event at Morgan. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself. I'm going to tell you about my journey. It's been a very interesting journey for me. How many of you Googled me before this event by any chance? Go ahead, raise your hand. I have people do it all the time. Okay, all right, just wondering. I've got an extensive career background in policing and law enforcement from the state of Maryland. And now I find myself in a place of advocating for something that, you know, maybe 30 years ago I never would have thought about, right? Advocating to end the failed policies of drug prohibition, the war on drugs. And before I get started, let me just say, this is interactive, folks. I know you guys had some pizza. You had a long day in class. And I know when I eat pizza, I just want to go to sleep. That's why I didn't have any pizza. So it's interactive. If you got questions, ask questions. Please do. This is a very, very important topic. Jacob mentioned some of the racial implications of the war on drugs. I really don't like that term because you can't have a war on drugs. You can't have a war on this podium. You can't have a war on the chairs you guys are sitting in. They just are. And it's about what we do with them. It's about the environment that they exist in, right? And that's up to us, right? So it's the same thing with drugs. They're inanimate. So it's about the environment that we create for them to exist. In the environment of drug prohibition policies, it's the worst possible thing we could have done as a society, as a country, with these drugs. And I say a country because we did it and then outsourced it to the rest of the world. So I got a couple notes here to keep me on task here because I got 30 minutes, more like 25 now, and I can talk about this stuff for 8 hours. Because it goes in so many directions. It affects so many areas and parts of our lives, especially for black folk. It does, and you're going to find that out if you don't already know that. These notes used to be on like 3x5 cards, right? You guys don't remember that, right? You do everything, okay. You know, so the war on drugs, I mean, it's many things. It's many things, and people have many definitions for it. But by my account, none of them are good. None of the fallout, none of the, how can I say, things that many people think the war on drugs is solving, none of it's good. I mean, so think about it. Why would we do this? Would we do this to reduce crime? Would we do this to reduce drug use? Would we do this to reduce addiction and overdose deaths? Right? So how's that going? Yeah, oops, right? Overdose deaths. Are they going down or are they going up? They're going up at a dramatic pace. The violence that surrounds the illicit drug market is reminiscent of the Al Capone days. I know none of you guys remember that. Jacob does. Going back into the 1920s, 1930s with alcohol prohibition. Right? And we ended up with the gang. See, those are the real gangsters. That's where all that came from, right? Back then, Chicago, right? Chicago, oh, Chi-Town, right? Okay. Okay. Love it, love it. And Chicago is still having tremendous problems with violence surrounding the drug trade. You see, at the foundation of Chicago's violence at the foundation of Baltimore's violence within the neighborhoods that I grew up in is that flourishing drug trade, is that underground economy that comes from it, right? You know, so when the boys on the corners, when they have disputes with other crews and other gangs because of infringement, right? In my territory, this is my territory, this is my corner, right? This is my neighborhood for selling and dealing what I'm dealing. They can't go to the police. When they get robbed by stick-up boys for their cash and their drugs, they can't go to the police because it's all illegal, right? And the stuff that they're selling, there's no quality control measures, right? So you wonder why we have the numbers of overdose deaths that we have. You wonder why we have the violence that follows the illicit market, again, just like alcohol prohibition and the murders and the shootouts and the drive-by shootings we had back in the 1920s and 30s, we have them today. Same scenario, different product. So let me talk a little bit about, so you can understand where I'm coming from, about my history, my journey with this, because I was a stone-cold drug warrior. Right? I worked narcotics, I worked undercover, I hung out on corners, I hung out in bars, I bought and pretended to sell drugs. Notice I said pretended, right? To sell drugs. I then commanded drug task forces. So now I'm in charge of groups and teams of police officers who were out there buying and selling drugs and locking folks up. And by far and large, most of the people we locked up looked like the folks in this room. Right? We targeted black communities more so than we targeted any white community. We would go out of our way to do that. Commanded drug task forces. Ended up commanding training for the Maryland State Police before I retired from there. Then went on to Baltimore City as a head of training in the city that I grew up in. Went on to a third police agency after that where I was the head of the Detective Bureau, again, doing drug work. But in the year 2000, so, I had the mindset that people who used drugs, people who dealt, with drugs, had anything to do with drugs, were bad people. Deserved to be locked up, whether you were using, whether you were selling. And there was a time where we were going after the so-called kingpins. And I'll circle back to that. There was a time that we went after the kingpins, the top of these organizations in our city centers. And then we dismantled their organizations, and, we ended up with many, many street corner organizations. But you know what? When we did that, I guess we got bored, because then we had this bright idea. Well, why don't we just go after the demand side? Just go after the people using. And the best place to go after the people who were using, it's out in the open, right? It's in our cities. Right? It's in our communities where we have homeless people and again, high concentrations of blacks, people of color. It was easy. And it was all about numbers. It became political very quick. Let me give you a quick piece of history. The war on drugs didn't start in the 1970s. The war on people, the war on black and brown people, did not start in the 1970s under Richard Nixon. I know many people think that. Started in the early 1900s, maybe late 1800s. The first major piece of policy was against the Chinese and opium in this country, going back to the late 1800s. But then when you come into the 1900s, there's a particular gentleman, a very interesting gentleman. His name is Anslinger, Harry Anslinger. Haven't you ever heard of this guy? A couple hands went up. Harry Anslinger, he was I guess you could say he was our first drug czar. He was the first head of the Bureau of Narcotics back in the 1920s, 1930s. Alcohol prohibition was on its way out, and he had a huge role in that, and he was losing that because we ended alcohol prohibition, and now it's legal to manufacture, transport, and sell again. So got these drugs, got this coke, got this heroin, opium, got marijuana. And how can I get this country to rally behind me, right? So back in the early 1900s in this country, just like today, racism was hot and heavy. but in a different way. You know, one of his first major victims, targets, was Billie Holiday. You know who Billie Holiday is? You better know who Billie Holiday is. Billie Holiday. Popular, well-known, black, jazz singer, right? If you get an opportunity, I want you to research yesterday's internet. I see people looking around. You know what yesterday's internet was? Newspapers. Right? You go back to the 1920s, 1930s, people got their information primarily through newspapers in the same way that you get it on your phones today. And if it's in the internet, it's got to be what, right? True. I'm glad you guys are laughing about that. So that you do your homework, do your research. It was the same thought process for many people with newspapers of the 1920s and 1930s. If it's in the newspaper, it's got to be true. So as Anslinger's talking about his now war on cocaine, it wasn't about cocaine, it was about the people who use cocaine. It was about blacks and jazz musicians who use heroin, right? These are our targets. This is the enemy, the scum of the earth. Look at some of the language. You can research these newspapers and you can see some of the language he was using, talking about black people as degenerates, talking about Mexicans who smoked marijuana, right? And what we have to do with them and how we have to pass these laws and put these people away, rid our society of these people. It sits squarely on a foundation of social control dealing with race, culture. And coming forward through the 40s and 50s, what is significant about the 1970s under Richard Nixon is that with federal funds, he was able to recruit local law enforcement into these enforcing these drug prohibition laws, like the Baltimore Police Department, for an example. And prior to that, it was pretty much the feds doing the work, and they didn't have the power, they didn't have the resources to do the damage that we're seeing today. But there were a number of things that also happened in the 1970s, and I know maybe a couple other speakers might touch on them, but I'll touch on it briefly, and it's very important because a lot of this is also, it's really about economic power, it's about political power. In the 1970s, we were experiencing a mass exodus of jobs in our city centers. You know, we blacks had migrated from the South, primarily coming north, Chicago, Detroit, Baltimore, all these major cities, because that's where the jobs were. Industry was booming. Education or not, you could get a well-paying job with a really good retirement. You know, my parents, that's where they were in that area. But then jobs started leaving the city centers. Industries started leaving. The steel industry ended up in China and it just left. And now you had all these people unemployed, mainly black men. But there was another opportunity. There were many opportunities. Like my dad, who was a longshoreman, when the port suffered, he had to go get a hustle. He ended up becoming a bookie for the illegal numbers racket, the 3-digit number. You see, it wasn't called the lotto back then. It was illegal. It was illegal in Maryland until 1976. I think it was July 29th when the first legal lotto number came out in Maryland. It was 408. Put my father out of a job. That was his hustle at the time. But there were a large group of folks that ended up selling drugs, becoming members of these organizations I was talking about. They had kingpins at the top. Baltimore had about 6. And under Richard Nixon and the money that came to us in Baltimore, law enforcement, we were able to go after these major drug organizations. And we did. And we broke them up, literally just turned 6 major organizations where they had agreements among themselves in how they were going to go about their business without violence, because it was about making money. But we went after those organizations, broke them up, ended up with 600 plus street corner operations where guns quickly became tools of the trade. And here we are today. That's just a little bit of background. In the enforcement of these laws, which I was a part of, a big part of this work that I do now, and going around speaking about this, writing about this, the failed war on drugs, and the reason we need to end it. You know, you're going to hear some other folks talk about incarceration, and the rates of incarceration. Michelle Alexander's book that Jacob mentioned, The New Jim Crow, you guys read it? Thank you. Thank you. Again, she talks about that foundation. She talks about Ehrlichman, one of Richard Nixon's aides, and he's talking about the conversations they used to have in the White House about this war on drugs, how they can go vilify, you know, it was the hippies and marijuana protesting against the war, but they could also vilify blacks in our organizations by going after drugs and being able to, you know, raid their homes and infiltrate their networks, all in the name of the law, all in the name of the war on drugs. Leading into this place, going into the 80s and the 90s, again, what the police were involved with mass incarceration. I mean, there's a gentleman by the name of Radley Belko, and you guys need to read this article. He recently did an article in the Washington Post talking about this. It's the article that he has just done, the piece that he has just written, is a very, very comprehensive piece, and it touches just about every area of the criminal justice system tied to the war on drugs. From first contact with citizens and the police, into the hands of the prosecutor, into the courtrooms with the juries and jury selection, and into the prisons and out the back end. And at every turn, even though we know that blacks and whites use and sell drugs at relatively the same rate, the rates of incarceration, first contact with the police, the rates of arrest are much higher. 2, 3, 4 times higher, depending upon where you are in the country. Then once you're arrested, and you're now in the hands of the prosecutor, the charges that you receive are greater than your white counterparts. The judge, when you are sentenced, the sentence is more severe than your white counterparts. The years and the months that you do while incarcerated are much more severe. In every part of the system, every single part of the system, the disparity rates are there. Any of you guys ever been stopped by the police while riding or driving in a car? What was that experience like for you? And some of you may be able to raise your hand 2, 3, 4 times. I know I can, right? Because when you know, even when I was in policing, if I wasn't in uniform, you know what? I was getting stopped. Up in Baltimore, you better believe it, I was getting stopped. Blacks get searched more often. Their cars get searched more often. Even though the rates are extremely low for finding any kind of fruits or evidence of a crime, including drugs, when you compare those numbers to whites. So it baffles me why we in policing stop more blacks than whites, because if we stop more whites, we're going to get more drugs. You got to read Radley's piece, again in the Washington Post, Balko. Very, very detailed, full of the data that you need, you know, to support these arguments. And I want to wrap up. Again, I can talk about this quite a bit, but I'm going to wrap up with 2 points. The first one is about police-community relations. So I'm talking about, I asked you a question about being stopped. I'm sure you guys are familiar with, you know, places like Ferguson, you know, and what's happened in Ferguson. The way the police were stopping citizens in Ferguson and the way they were being cited for very, very trivial traffic violations at an extremely high rate, and the fines that have been levied upon people. And I want to say something, because it's kind of, it is related. that when we talk about removing criminal sanctions from something and then placing it into the civil realm, right? Okay, you're no longer going to go to jail for this one. You know, we're going to write you a ticket. And we're seeing this in many of our states regarding marijuana reform, right? There are a number of states that have legalized marijuana use for adults. We have medical marijuana programs in over half of our states. And I think it's 9 states for adult use. Some people refer to it as recreational use, but there are a number of states that have decriminalized, did I do that? That have decriminalized marijuana possession. So we're no longer going to lock you up or put handcuffs on you, arrest you for possessing marijuana. We're going to write you a ticket. You know what? Those tickets and how they're being written and the rate, the disparity issues with the issuing of those tickets, again, is extremely high in the black community. And what happens when you can't pay a $200 ticket? I'm talking again about Ferguson, right? All these fines that were being levied upon the citizens, they couldn't pay them. So what happens? You end up with a bench warrant. You end up in jail. At the end of the day, you still end up in jail. Call it debtor's prison. Excuse me? There you go, the workhouse. Speaking of that, the prison industrial complex. You know, if you haven't seen the documentary 13th, you got to watch it. Most definitely. Thank you, brother. Again, police-community relations has always been bad in this country because policing in this country sits on a foundation of slavery. That's a whole nother talk. But this is a whole nother tool. This is a separate tool. The war on drugs, the war on people, the war on black and brown people is a separate tool for continuing to deal with that, for keeping that in place. And as we, in policing, let me just say this. As each of you leave here, if you drive away from this campus, a police officer can stop you, can pull you over, walk up to your car, and search your car, despite the Fourth Amendment, anytime they feel like it. Do you realize that? Because they only have to say one thing. I smell weed. I smell weed. And how can you dispute that? What recourse do you have? What's the process for that? There is none. So whether they smell it or not, it's probable cause for them to search your car. And there's nothing that can be done about it. That's just a small reason why we need to end this. And we know that any time you have interaction with the police and you're a person of color, anything can happen. We've seen it. We know it. And I'll end with this. At the end of the day, what we're talking about here is disenfranchisement of a people. The loss of political power. In Florida, right now, we're working on a constitutional amendment, Amendment 4. See, we were talking earlier. You said 1 in 4 people, 1 in 4 blacks in Florida right now cannot vote. 1 in 4. What does that mean, really? I mean, what does that equate to after an election and you got 1 in 4 who can't vote? We know how tough it is just to get people to vote. But when 1 in 4 can't vote, and it's largely because of if you're a convicted felon and you return home, you've paid your debt, so-called debt to society, you know what? You can't vote. And the numbers of people who continue to go in to our jails and in our prisons under this umbrella of the war on drugs, drug prohibition policies, continues to be enormous. And we can talk about mandatory minimum sentencing, and we can talk about the prison industrial complex, who's making money left and right and so on. Hopefully the other speakers will touch on that. But the disenfranchisement of the black community is severe because of these policies. The disintegration of the black family unit is heavy because of these policies, because of the numbers of people that we have and continue to put in our jails and prisons who come out, can't get jobs, can't get a license to cut hair, can't get a license to be an electrician or a plumber, can't get a college loan, can't go to college in many cases because of that drug conviction. That's why you guys are important, extremely important for when you leave here and what you do and how you continue to educate yourselves regarding these pieces of policy. That's it for me.